Do you think there is a deadline for Christmas for peace negotiations?
No, I think that everyone wants this war to end. No, I've talked to a lot of Ukrainians. You've talked to a lot of Ukrainians. Everybody wants this war to end. And if it can happen tomorrow, great. If it can happen next week, great. If it can happen by Christmas, great.
Where does this narrative come from?
Comes from Russia. You're exactly right. This is what the Russians have been saying over and over and over. And the Russians can decide if they can live with that or not. The Russians have not indicated any flexibility whatsoever. So if President Trump really wants a deal, if he really wants to end this war along the lines that he's described and that Marco Rubio has described, then President Trump is going to have to put some pressure on Putin.
The stakes for Ukraine are high, and every decision in Washington now directly shapes the battlefield and the months ahead. To understand how the U.S. sees this moment, we turn to one of the most respected American voices on Ukraine. Joining me now is Ambassador William Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and a leading diplomat whose insights influence policymakers in Washington and across Europe. Ambassador Taylor, it's my pleasure to have you here in our studio. Welcome.
Nataliia, thank you very much for having me.
So before we go into all this negotiation process, I want to start with a bigger strategic picture. The new U.S. national security strategy under President Trump marks the sharpest shift in American foreign policy since the Cold War. And it puts the Western Hemisphere first, focuses on domestic security and economic dominance across the Americas, and elevates the Indo-Pacific to the second tier and places Europe much lower, with unusually, harsh language about Europe's economic and civilizational decline. Ukraine appears only in the context of reducing U.S. commitments abroad and pushing allies to carry far more of the burden. If Ukraine is no longer a central priority in U.S. strategy, what can Kyiv realistically do to stay visible, relevant, and strategically important for Washington?
So, Nataliia, Ukraine will continue to be strategically important, and we will continue to work at this issue of making Ukraine secure and sovereign as long as it takes. President Trump apparently is not listening to the national security strategy. President Trump is continuing to focus on this issue. He's been in conversations within the last 2 days with President Zelensky and the leaders of France, Germany, and Britain. So President Trump puts this very high, puts the Ukraine issue, Russia's war on Ukraine, at the top of his agenda. He spent more time on this than any other single foreign policy issue, no matter what the national security strategy says. So I think what Ukraine needs to do is to continue to hold tough on the battlefield, continue to interact, engage with the Americans and the Europeans. It needs to be tough on negotiations. It doesn't need to bend. It doesn't need to concede. It needs to defend its own interest, which it is doing. And President Trump recognizes that strength.
Yes, I see. But Ambassador Taylor, I'm sorry, at the East Europe Foundational talks, you said that President Trump sincerely wants to end Russia's war in Ukraine. And even if part of that motivation may be the Nobel Prize he hopes to get and win. But do you see that despite the fact that American president is so eager to end the Russia's war in Ukraine, do you think he's truly prepared to increase pressure on dictator Putin? And by pressure, I mean, of course, sanctions or something else.
We will see, Nataliia. We will see. You're right. He does want to win the Nobel Prize. That's one of the reasons that I am convinced that he is going to continue to focus on this issue, continue to work hard on this issue. And if he really wants a Nobel Prize, he will have to put pressure on Putin, because you don't get a Nobel Prize for appeasement or capitulation. That's not peace. That's not a lasting peace. You don't give the aggressor rewards for invading if you really want a peace. So I believe that he will continue that President Trump will continue to push, yes, to get credit. And if he succeeds, when he succeeds, to have Ukraine come out with Ukraine with a sovereign Ukraine, with European, a democratic, independent, prosperous, secure Ukraine. That's fine. That's the goal. And if he does that, then sure, peace prize.
Yeah, and following on that one, Ambassador Taylor, my sources inside the Ukrainian president's office say that Washington appears more open to some of the Russian proposal than Kyiv expected, especially on Donbass and the idea of demilitarized zone that Russia would not mirror. From your experience, why would the United States lean towards accepting criteria that clearly rewards, as you said, Russian aggression?
There's no reason. There's no reason to lean towards the Russian view. That proposal, that 28-point plan, Natalie, that you've talked about over, and we've all looked at and read, that was written by the Kremlin, given to Steve Witkoff, modified, and then leaked by the Russians. And that's what we've looked at. We haven't seen the 20-point plan that President Zelensky has worked out with the Europeans and sent to the Americans. We haven't seen that yet, so we don't know what's in that. We don't know what the U.S. response to that proposal is. But there's no reason for the Americans to be leaning towards the Russian plan. None. We should be supporting the Ukrainians. And Secretary Rubio, National Security Advisor Rubio, has also made it clear that we want to see a sovereign Ukraine, a sovereign, independent, democratic European Ukraine with security, with secure borders that it can defend. So that continues to be the goal.
Do you think there is a deadline for Christmas for peace negotiations?
No, I think everyone wants this war to end. No, I've talked to a lot of Ukrainians. You've talked to a lot of Ukrainians. Everybody wants this war to end. Wants the war to end tomorrow, the next day. Wants this war to end in a dignified, honorable way that preserves Ukraine's sovereignty and independence. And Europeanness and security and prosperity. Everybody wants that. And if it can happen tomorrow, great. If it can happen next week, great. If it can happen by Christmas, great. If it takes until the New Year's, that's what it takes.
How do you assess the current state of diplomatic negotiations? What sincerely, genuinely gives you hope, and what really raises a concern?
I'll tell you, what gives me hope is that the Ukrainians and Americans are deeply engaged in this process. And I am reminded of the minerals deal. You reported that our Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, showed up in Ukraine with a first draft of the minerals deal back in the spring. And he walked into President Zelensky's office and put this draft down on the desk and asked for an agreement. Asked President Zelensky to agree to that draft. And President Zelensky said no. What we do is we analyze it. We have our experts analyze it, our mining experts, our lawyers, my advisors, and we'll make you a counterproposal. And that's exactly what he did. He made a counterproposal. Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Treasury, was not happy, but he agreed to go back and talk about this counterproposal. And that went back and forth a couple of times. And in the end, the minerals deal came out pretty well. That same thing seems to be going on right now. That same process, that same procedure seems to be happening right now. This 28-point plan, unacceptable, drafted by the Russians, leaked by the Russians, and rejected by the Ukrainians, rejected by the Europeans, and really rejected by Marco Rubio. And now President Zelensky and the Europeans have made a counterproposal, a 20-point counterproposal sent into Washington yesterday, I understand. And that's the process, to go back and forth. And they will come out, I am confident, with an agreement that works for the Ukrainians, that works for the Americans, that they will then present to the Russians. And the Russians can decide if they can live with that or not. The Russians have not indicated any flexibility whatsoever. So if President Trump really wants a deal, if he really wants to end this war along the lines that he's described and that Marco Rubio has described, then President Trump is going to have to put some pressure on Putin. And he can do that, as you just indicated, militarily, financially, sanctions, as well as diplomatically.
And not only once, we've heard from Florida, from the meeting of Ukrainian and American delegations, that Russia really wants some peace agreement with Ukraine. What is your take on that? Do you believe that?
I don't. I don't. There's been no indication that the Russians are really, actually, in fact, interested in a peace agreement with Ukraine. They want you. We all know this. We all know what President Putin has said. What he really wants. He wants to dominate. He wants to eliminate Ukraine. So he doesn't want to negotiate or compromise with the Ukrainians or the Americans over Ukraine, for that matter. So no, I don't think the Russians are serious about this whole process.
Ambassador Taylor, and does it worry you that Europe is somehow almost absent from this process? Not almost, but partially, nearly push to the sidelines.
They have been, but they have reasserted themselves several times, Nataliia. Several times the Ukrainians have invited the Europeans in, and the Europeans have made phone calls and have shown up in Washington, in the White House, with President Zelensky, to support President Zelensky. And then over just the past couple of days, the President Trump and the leaders of Britain, France, and Germany have gotten on the phone, and the Europeans have asserted themselves, have reminded President Trump that a lot depends on the Europeans in this agreement. The security guarantees that are so important for Ukraine, and only if Ukraine gets solid security guarantees will the Ukrainians be willing to sign this agreement, as I understand it. So that's up to the Europeans to provide most of the security guarantee. The Europeans, of course, want some support from the Americans on that security guarantee, and that will come as well. But the Europeans are really a major part of the security guarantee that is a crucial part of this plan. The second thing, Nataliia, is the frozen assets. As we all know, most of the frozen Russian assets are in European banks. Most of them are in Belgium. Most of them are in Euroclear. So the Europeans need to get those assets in a way that either a loan or some other way to Ukraine to enable Ukrainians to be financially solid for the next 2 or 3 years with that $300 billion worth of Russian frozen assets. And the Ukrainians know, the Americans know, that the Europeans are key to the frozen assets. So for both of those reasons, the Europeans have to be involved. President Trump understands that. That's why he got on the phone to them over the past 2 days.
And from what I've heard from my sources, the next week will be very pivotal moment for Ukraine regarding those 300,000 Russian frozen assets, because there will be a summit in Brussels, EU summit, and they will decide, though. Some decision will come from that meeting. And also, do you see a risk that Washington's desire for profitable business deals with Russia could ultimately steer the negotiations into a direction that is dangerous for Ukraine?
No. I think that the possibility of business deals will come after this war ends. This will come after the Russians agree to a peace deal with the Ukrainians and the Americans. It's only after the Russians stop the war that there can be really any interesting talk about commercial deals, whether it's in Russia, whether it's in Ukraine, wherever. It cannot happen while the Russians continue to bombard Ukraine. And so after the war ends, after the Russians realize that they can't win, Putin realizes that he can't win, and he stops the war, then fine. There can be some business deals. I'll be surprised, frankly, to tell you, I'll be surprised if American firms are going to be very interested in investing in Russia. Would you invest in Russia? I wouldn't invest in Russia, knowing what they do, knowing how they're governed, knowing what they have done to Ukraine, knowing what they have done to their own businesses, their own opposition. Yeah, would you? No one in their right mind is going to be investing in Russia. But that's not even an interesting, relevant question until after this war ends.
Yes. And also some Western politicians argue that sanctions against Russia have only made Putin more furious and more violent, but not weaker. In your view, do sanctions still remain the most effective tool against the Kremlin in 2025?
No, not the most effective. The most effective tool are Ukrainian armed forces reinforced by Europeans and American armed forces. That's
Yeah.
the most effective tool. After that, sanctions can help. Sanctions have already had an effect on the Russian economy. The sanctions on the Russian oil sector have already reduced the flow of revenues that the Russians get from selling oil and gas, exporting oil and gas. Has reduced that flow by 20, 30% by some estimates. And that means that the Russian economy and the Russian treasury is being starved of those revenues. That means that the Russians will have a harder and harder time prosecuting this war. They don't have the money to continue to do this war. So, yeah, the sanctions are having an effect, not decisive effect, not decisive yet. But the flow of funds into the Russian economy and treasury and into the war machine is having a cumulative effect on Putin's ability to run this war. So first, our weapons and success on the battlefield. And then second would be the sanctions. Third, again, I come back to these $300 billion of Russian frozen central bank assets that are going to be really important for Ukraine, and also a strong message to Putin that he cannot win.
And since this summer, we got through a very turbulent period. I mean, we in Ukraine. How does Washington view Ukraine's internal challenges as the country continues to fight, adapt, and stay resilient under extreme pressure, but having its own internal problems?
So I was just there last week, and I've been there 12 times since the big war started, and I have seen all of these issues. We've also heard President Trump talk about the bravery, just in the past week, the bravery of Ukrainians and the resilience. So the Americans recognize that all nations have internal politics and internal political problems. Everybody recognizes that all nations have their own corruption problems. Ukraine, yes, has its own corruption problem. It knows it. It has established NABU and SAPO and the High Anti-Corruption Court. There was a threat to the independence of NABU and SAPO this summer, which was then turned around. NABU and SAPO have used that independence, that reaffirmed independence, to go after a big scam in the energy field, in Energoatom. And that's what NABU and SAPO are supposed to do. That's what they found out. They found out there's a big problem there, which President Zelensky, as I understand it, is encouraging and supporting that investigation. He's fired a couple of ministers. Andriy Yermak is no longer the head of the administration, head of the president's office. And the top priority for the Americans and the Europeans and Ukrainians is to win the war. And yes, they have to deal with corruption. We've all had to deal with corruption over the years, and that will continue. But what's most important right now is to win this war, is to stop the Russians, is to prevail against the Russians and end their aggression against Ukraine.
Yeah, I assume it's not easy for Ukraine to cope with all the challenges we have. To fight with corruption without war, it's one thing, but to combine everything, it's much more complicated. And also, President Trump recently echoed a Kremlin talking point about elections before peace. In your opinion, where does this narrative come from?
Comes from Russia. You're exactly right. This is what the Russians have been saying over and over and over. Again, I've been to Ukraine a lot, every couple of months for the past 3.5 years, and many times before that. And I have yet to talk to Ukrainians who are pushing for elections now. I haven't heard that from the government. I haven't heard it from the opposition leaders, opposition parties. I haven't heard it from civil society. I haven't heard it from democracy advocates in Ukraine. I haven't heard anyone talking about the importance or the need for or the push for elections right now. Everybody understands, including President Zelensky, that after the war, when security allows, there'll be elections. Everybody understands that. Everybody looks forward to that. To have elections after the war ends, that's exactly right. President Zelensky has said, fine, if you want to have elections, I'm ready to have elections, but there needs to be security. You can't pull soldiers off the line to come vote while the Russians are attacking the front line. You can't do that. You can't have elections while there are 6 million Ukrainians abroad who need to be able to vote. And the infrastructure is not there to allow them to do that. So President Zelensky said, fine, if you Americans and you Europeans can assure us that the elections will be secure, we'll do them. We'll do them. That's fine. The problem, of course, is no one can secure Ukraine until the Russians stop fighting. So we need to solve the war. We need to end the war. We need to resolve the Russian aggression before we have elections, and that will happen. Everybody looks forward to elections, but only when it's secure.
Yeah, I've heard that President Zelensky doesn't mind about the elections, but we need security guarantees. But at the same time, we need to change our constitution for that, because for now it doesn't allow us to do that.
Correct, and that's an internal issue that President Zelensky and the Rada and the government and the people of Ukraine will have to deal with. The point is, elections, in my view, will happen only after the war ends, only when it's secure, and secure for a long enough time. You can't have security. You can't have the war stop for a day or 2 days. You need 3, 6, 9 months to prepare serious elections. You need time to campaign. You need time probably to change the law, the election law. As you said, if you want to do it during the war, you got to change the Constitution. That's not something that happens quickly. And in order to do any of that, you need to have the end of the fighting.
Yes. And finally, Ambassador Taylor, earlier this autumn, in September, you sounded optimistic about future financial support for Ukraine. Do you still keep that optimism now?
Absolutely. That's the $300 billion that are the Russian central bank reserves that are frozen, mostly in European banks, but also some in American, some in British, some in Japanese. That's $300 billion, which would keep Ukraine going for 3 years. Would solve the financial issues for Ukraine for 3 years, and the Europeans are working very hard, and they are getting very close, I believe, very close, within a week or two of solving that problem. They're working real hard with the Belgians. The Belgians have been resistant, and I think the Brits and the Germans and the French will work closely with the Belgians and convince them that this is important to do. The Europeans have also figured out a way to solve that problem by going around Hungary. Hungary will not be able to stop this in the current proposal. This will be an emergency procedure that Ursula von der Leyen is talking about. And so I think they've gotten very close, and I think we're within a week of having a solution to that problem.
Yeah, I've heard about this actually emergency procedure just yesterday or days ago. I mean, why haven't they used that before? I was asking myself, like, to overcome the obstacle, which name is Hungary.
The obstacle's name is Hungary, and the reason they haven't done it before is it's kind of the last resort. It's an emergency measure. When other things have not worked, or when Hungary threatens to stop other procedures, other ways to provide those funds to Ukraine, you have to go around Hungary and maybe others. But you can do it with a majority, a qualified majority in the European Union, and they haven't done it before because this is an emergency procedure.
Yeah, and actually about the financial support, I've heard that BlackRock from the United States, they are in the process to give to Ukraine this $400 billion for reconstruction. Or for the army. I don't know where this money will flow. But I'm really optimistic regarding that support as well. So Ambassador Taylor, it was a great honor for me and pleasure to have you here online in our studio, and I hope to see you next time.
Thank you, Nataliia. Good to be here.